Hey folks, welcome back to the podcast. As part of our new live Psychedelic Podcast series, we hosted Tonia Erin for the show today. Tonia is a woman who enrolled in our inaugural cohort for our Practitioner certification program. She was in a full-time job at Adobe, working in tech as a product manager, and through her own personal psychedelic work, ended up enrolling in our practitioner training program as a career transition from that work at Adobe. And now a few years later, she is fully working and immersed in the psychedelic space. And so I wanted to bring her on to talk through about that transition from product management at a major tech company to her startup life and world. We get into a little bit about a company called Energy.Work, which she has been a co-founder of and helping to support and grow, and also her own practices and her own practitioner work as a prep and integration coach in this space. And what's so beautiful about Tonia is her life's work is woven from threads of deep spiritual inquiry and a heartfelt calling to facilitate transformation and healing. Having ventured through the realms of technology and leadership, she has found her true passion in bridging the ancient wisdom of earth-based practices with modern approaches to personal growth. Now, for over 2 decades, Tonia immersed herself in the tech industry where she led teams and pioneered innovative projects. Yet, beneath the surface, she was cultivating a rich inner landscape through her studies and practices in spirituality and self-development. And her journey took a transformative turn when she embraced the profound teachings of psychedelics, which helped to deepen her relationship with herself and the world of others. Driven by a vision to support others on their paths of self-discovery, she left the corporate world to dedicate herself to coaching and healing work. She is a certified coach specializing in psychedelic preparation and integration with a passion for creating sacred spaces and facilitating ceremonies that honor the rites of passage that unfold throughout our lives. So in this conversation, you'll hear us talk about this bridge between the technological world and the spiritual world. We also go into ultra low dose 5-MeO DMT. Tonia has been working with that as a personal practice, and we talk about the utility of that, how that can be useful, what transformative outcomes can result from that. And in talking about that bridge between technology and the spiritual world, we get into a really deep discussion about the role of the feminine, and specifically Tonia's work with women and why she believes it's so important in this third wave of psychedelics. So I think you're really going to enjoy this podcast today with Tonia. If you enjoy the podcast, feel free to share it with a friend or two, leave a review on iTunes or Spotify, and join the conversation at community.thethirdwave.co, our platform for all things psychedelic. All right, that's it for now. I hope you enjoy my conversation today with Tonia Erin. So I provided a little bit of an intro for those of you who are listening live. Welcome. We're going to explore quite a few different things today. Now, Tonia, where I'd love to start is, I remember first connecting with you a few years ago when you had expressed an interest in enrolling in the initial cohort for our practitioner training program. And at that point in time, you were still working full-time at Adobe. And Adobe is a well-known design platform. And so I'd love to just start there. What was it that you loved about your work at Adobe? Why was it that I think you had spent maybe over 10 years working for Adobe. So what had you in that role, in that position as a product manager, working for a really big tech company, a few years ago now?
Yeah. Well, I went back to school to get my degree and worked in IT for a long time, 10, 11 years before that. And my dream was really to work for a software company. Like that was the big dream. So Adobe was actually a big dream for me to work for, and especially because I love their software. I'd worked with their software for years, including in web development. So I was really excited to work for Adobe for a long time. And what really excited me about the company was the innovation and the design. I mean, everything about the way that they treated us. I was treated really well. I was paid really well. It was all the things. It was definitely all the things of that time in my life, for sure. It checked all the boxes. And I worked in 7 different roles in those 11 years that I worked there. So I was able to move around a lot. I learned a lot. That's really what kept me there, I think, is that I could continuously find new things to do and learn. That is one of the things that motivates me probably more than anything, is learning, which is what I loved so much about coming to Third Wave too. And I was looking for, I had gone through, while I was at Adobe, I'd gone through a coaching certification program through Coactive Training Institute and had certified in coaching. And after a leadership program with that same company, I realized that I wanted to work in psychedelics, specifically around coaching. There wasn't really anything out there at the time. That was in 2019 or so. And it was very clear I wanted to coach around psychedelics. Didn't really know how to go about that or where to go. So when your program kind of popped up, it actually popped up for my partner. She was studying microdosing, and she had been to your website multiple times learning about microdosing. And she's the one that actually got the email and sent it to me. And so that's how it serendipitously happened. I was like, this is exactly what I was looking for, something specifically around coaching and psychedelics.
So you were at Adobe. It was a dream job. They took really great care of you. You were able to hold multiple roles, continuously learning. Why is it that you left then? What was it about the role that was done for you that was no longer calling to you?
I think it's multiple things. One, COVID was pretty rough in that process of being home. A lot of, I think, also what kept me at Adobe was the employee networks. I was involved in the Women at Adobe, the LGBTQ plus group. I was in leadership and diversity and inclusion council. Like, I did a lot of that extracurricular stuff around diversity and inclusion, which really helped, I think, give meaning. So the thing that was difficult at this stage of my life, one, having gone through multiple psychedelic experiences, which opened up my mind to more of my purpose and what was meaningful to me, what I cared about, and realized that a lot of the work, the hours, the time, the energy that I was putting into Adobe wasn't really going into anything that mattered to me. And that's what really started to become clear, is that I wasn't contributing to anything meaningful. Like, it felt a lot like contributing to a huge machine, and you're like one piece in this big machine, and it doesn't feel like it's making it out into people, which is why I liked coaching and why I liked doing coaching at Adobe, because that was the part that really felt like I was having an impact on people. And really, that's relationships are what are important to me. That's where it feels like the meaning is in life, is in relationship. And so that was the main reason that I ended up feeling like it was time for me to leave. And that was a big, scary leap. I have a lot of conditioning, obviously, around the security of a paycheck and insurance and all of those things that clearly I could have kept going as long as I wanted to. So that's a big, scary leap. Probably one of the things that helped me was thinking, I could always go back. And I was reassured, you always have a place here if you ever want to come back. So that helps, but it doesn't completely alleviate the fear of jumping off the cliff of leaving the steady job, right? And that's kind of where I've come from. So,
and how did your personal work with psychedelics help give you that courage to make the leap?
Yeah. I think the big thing with psychedelics is touching into the bigger part of me that knows that there's more to do than what I was doing. And it's the door that opens up to that bigger heart or the higher consciousness or whatever you want to call it. Everybody has different names for it, but it was that piece that was so clear. The door just opens wide to see what is really meaningful and what really matters. And, the secure paycheck isn't the most meaningful and important thing in that space, right? In fact, it hardly even matters. And I do have, there is some cushion there for me. It's not like I went blind and I have no way to make my bills. Like I do have a little bit of cushion. So, just to let people know that it's not like, you still have to plan. You still have to make sure that you feel comfortable enough that you can take the leap. And I did. I felt comfortable enough. But it was definitely opening that door to seeing things from that higher perspective that gave me, I think, the courage and the understanding of why it was important.
Now, when we talk about this practitioner training program, when you enrolled, it was called the coaching certification program. A lot of people look at that from the outside and they go, oh, great, this is knowledge and expertise to become a coach, to help with prep, to help with integration, to help someone understand how to navigate this. But I do think there's another aspect of it, which is when you're surrounded by other people who are on a similar path, like the folks that were in the cohort who are also in a point of transition. They're looking at how they can get involved in this emerging space. I'm curious for you, going through, I think the initial cohort that we did, it was maybe a 4 to 5 month cohort. It was a bit more condensed. It was like our beta or our initial experiment. And so how did that time in the training program, and specifically how did the relationships you formed through that training program help with the transition out of corporate into doing something that was not nearly as sort of planned and mapped out in terms of if you do X, Y, and Z, that this will happen down the road?
Yeah. Well, I think, as you know, one of the key components of that program was the relationships that were formed. So how can I specifically say the support that I've received, other people, like you said, going through similar experiences, but also encouragement. There was a lot of encouragement from people in the cohort, and then also people in the next cohorts, right? That then we start to connect through the cohorts that come after me. And there were people that have been very influential in, kind of walking that path a little bit before me. And I don't think Lauren would disagree or have a problem with me mentioning her name. She's been a big part of that, walking the path just a little bit before me. And what I really love is when I tell people that I quit my job, that most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, people are excited for me. It's like, that's so great. I'm so excited for you. There is something about people following their heart and their spirit towards something that they believe in, that's important to them, that is exciting, and it's needed in our world. Like, we need more people to be following their dream, their heart. Yeah. So
I love that. And
yeah, go ahead.
Keep going.
Well, I was going to say, to kind of circle back on your original question about relationship and the importance of relationship. I think in this particular community specifically, they have been vital for my growth, as a mirror, for seeing myself, also as a way to give back and contribute what I can the other direction. So it definitely feels like both ways. I have an opportunity to give back, and people have helped me. So there is this reciprocal thing that happens, I think, in this community that is really beautiful and supportive.
I love that. Now, the woman you mentioned, Lauren Mugleby, whose house I am at right now, in fact, in the East Bay, it's where I'm hosting this this live podcast from. Just to give a little bit more color to that, Lauren had worked for Meta or Facebook, another really big tech company, for a very long time, came to realize that they talked a lot about being conscious, but the actual practice internally was not all that conscious, and ended up doing an executive coaching training and then our training program as well. And so Lauren was able to kind of map that territory. And what I think you spoke to, and what Lauren was also very fortunate to have, is the financial stability to be able to make that leap and make that transition. And that's what I'm hearing even in your communications, that it helps to be set up, it helps to plan out, it helps to understand that. And this is something we talk about a lot in the training program, especially for people who are making that career transition out of corporate. Sometimes there is this expectation of, oh yeah, I want to replace my income within a year or even within 2 years. And there's I think two elements to this, which is one, psychedelic work, whether that's as a coach or practitioner or even a guide, as more and more people are getting into that, will likely never be as lucrative as a high-paying tech job. I think that's just the sort of fundamental truth of how this is and what happens. But the other thing is, it can take a while to make that transition, to fully step into it. And a lot of people are not necessarily doing it full time. They may have other gigs that they are also stepping into. They may even stay on as a consultant in the tech world while they sort of get this other aspect of their career, their professional pursuits up and going. And some people will also just dive into the startup world. And so I want to talk about that with you for a little bit, because I think you're somewhat rare in that in our group of practitioners, many of them just end up transitioning into becoming coaches and practitioners. It could be a side gig or a full-time gig. Many of them are full-time coaches already, and they're weaving psychedelics into their practice. You have done that. You are actively practicing with sort of a coaching framework and weaving psychedelics into that. But you also, over the last year and a half, have started a company called Energy.Work. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what is Energy.Work, but more importantly, why is it that you chose to begin that path of pursuing a startup? What inspired you or motivated you to go down that route?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The thing that I talked about earlier about why I went to Adobe in the first place was because I wanted to work for a software company. And the truth is, I love technology. I feel like technology can actually be a great gateway for us to do all kinds of beautiful things for our culture, for our world. So I think the main thing is I feel like I'm a bridge between the technology world and the spiritual world. And when I was working for Adobe, I felt like I kind of had my foot in both worlds, and I couldn't bring one to the other. Like I couldn't bring my spiritual self, the psychedelic realm, like all of that part of me, which is a huge part of me, ceremonial part of what I do in my life. I couldn't bring that to Adobe. There was no place for it. And I couldn't really bring Adobe into that world either. I mean, it was funding, which I'm deeply grateful for how much it funded of my life, but I couldn't bridge them there. And so with Energy.Work, it was actually my co-founder, David Gonzalez, also known as Gonzo. It was him that presented this idea of Energy.Work to me. And he wanted to build something that could support this community. And he also loves technology. He's the technical co-founder. So he's also the, he's the brains and definitely the tech person, the AI person. He's been in, that role, that, really technical piece where I'm more on program management, product management, more of the development piece and software development piece. So he he's really the one that brought it to me. And we realized that we both had this vision around bringing the skills that we have in this area of technology and our passion for technology to this world of self-development, well-being, and even psychedelics, and specifically people using psychedelics to improve their well-being and to improve their selves, right? Their lives. And we knew that there's a gap here. There's a gap in connecting people. There's a gap in technology really supporting us. And I think that's what we're wanting to do, is use technology to support people on this path. Now, we've spent a lot of time in this iterative creative process of thinking about what that is, what that looks like. And in the meantime, my co-founder became a CTO of another company because he needed to make some money. And also, I think it's a really good fit for him right now. And he's supporting something that he cares about. And it's also learning and building skills around what we want to do. So that a little bit put some slowdown on it. Plus, I think for me, one of the things that I've realized most recently is I was still taking a lot of that corporate mentality with me. And what I mean by that is I still had, and I probably still do have, but definitely I'm spending time and letting go of these ways of thinking about doing business, ways of thinking of even around building things. And it's based on what we know and what's already out there. And what I'm finding is, in order for us to build something really innovative, especially around helping people in this space, then I really need to let go of all of my conceptions around what it is to build a business and what it is to build a product. And that is the process I'm in right now as we speak. It's kind of a letting go to let emerge. And we have a lot of soil, we have a lot of nutrients, we have a lot of ideas that are brewing that I think once it has a little bit of time to marinate, then something is going to emerge that will be the next way of, I think, supporting people in this work specifically.
So Greg dropped a great question in the chat here, which I will rephrase and sort of have just about these contradictions between the spiritual and tech world, which you mentioned a little bit, how a lot of more spiritually inclined people have this sort of allergic reaction to technology. In fact, a lot of the utopian dreams of people who get deep into psychedelic or spiritual work are buying land, living there with friends and family, living off grid, working in the garden, and not being as sort of dependent on or connected to technology. And it sort of reminds me of this frame of how do we let technology serve us, but not be beholden to technology as our sort of master. So technology becomes a slave rather than the master, so to say. So I'd just be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that contradiction. How do you see the role of technology in supporting people in their spiritual development? What utility might it have in that process?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one I ponder a lot. I think ultimately I've had those dreams of living off grid somewhere, nowhere, where I don't have to participate, you could say. But the truth is, if I really want to have an impact in this world, and I do, then we have to utilize all the resources that we have at our disposal to do that. And I think ultimately this contradiction that we see with technology and spirituality is incentive. It really lives in the heart of the organization, right? So if we build organizations that have at their center or their core a desire to improve our situation as a community, as a culture, as a world, then you have very different incentives, right, around how you build that company and how you support that company and how the people in the company feel about the work they're doing and their own contributions to that. And so I think this is what's missing. It's not necessarily that they're automatically contraindicated. Like I believe you really can bring the two pieces together and form something that could change. And one of the things, I was listening to a podcast with Rochelle yesterday, and she was in our first cohort. And she was also talking about this change that happens kind of one person at a time, one leader at a time, and the ripple effect of that, and how this is how things really happen. This is how things really change, right? We create something that now becomes the new thing that everybody uses and works with, and that replaces what doesn't work anymore. But this is one of the things I really love also about technology is the engineering approach, right? The engineering approach asks the question, is this working? And this is the constant loop, right? Is this working? No, it's not working. Oh, let's try this. Oh, that's working. Okay, now it's working. And we kind of have this idea that if we harnessed the minds and the energy of the engineers, right, to look at the biggest problems we have in our world, and we actually approach it like that, like, obviously, our healthcare system is not working. Like, we can say that for a lot of people. It's obvious, like, we have data. We know this is not working for a lot of people. So you try things, you experiment, you see, well, maybe this might work. And then this is the kind of, I think, ingenuity that we're missing in our world right now, is this idea of like, we try stuff and we see if it works and we test it. We have data, we understand if it's working. And if it's not working, we try something else. But this is kind of how I think about how engineering, software development, technology, if you put all these things together and you apply some of the approaches to even how we live our lives, how we develop, how we improve ourselves, then you've kind of brought the two worlds together in a way that are cohesive.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing we talk a lot about is how psychedelic use is a skill that can be developed. And often what I emphasize in our training program is so many people want to come in and they just want the cookie cutter model. They want the prescription. They just want to be told what to do. And there's really a way in which every practitioner or someone who wants to become a practitioner that's stepping into psychedelics has to do their own tinkering. They have to do their own experiments. They have to do them maybe first on themselves and then maybe with a small group of friends. In fact, this is what Sasha Shulgin used to do back in the day, is he would be inventing all these new psychedelics. He would try it himself first, and then he would have this sort of small council. I think it was 6 or 7 people that would meet at his house in Lafayette, which is just down the road from where I am. And they would try these psychedelics and tinker with them and get a sense of, oh, this is how it works. This is what I'm noticing. This is what I'm experiencing. Right. And so I think that idea of tinkering, that idea of iteration is also very, very relevant for practitioners who want to step into the psychedelic space, that especially when we're working outside the confines of a clinical or regulated framework, there's a lot of possibility. And this will lead to my next question, which is, as a software engineer, as someone who has gone through our training program, as someone who has, you're doing a lot of coaching, weaving in psychedelics as part of a coaching container for the prep and the integration. How would you define your own engineering process as it relates to psychedelic work?
That's a really great question. How would I mean, it feels like one big experiment. I mean, in the whole scheme of things. And there's an awareness that happens. I think this is one of the biggest things that I've noticed for people is an awareness that people have after they experience psychedelics or even microdosing, an awareness that comes that all of a sudden you can start to see how you see things differently, think about something differently, respond differently. Things look differently than before. And I think the experiment part is the awareness of what has changed or shifted since this experience, whatever that experience is. And I think that that's really what it is. It's kind of like how has this changed or shifted? Or, I think about some of the experimenting with, I'll just say MDMA is one that takes, like, there is some times that I've experimented with that it did not feel very helpful. Like, it was very difficult to recover from. That was maybe not something worth what I got out of it. And then I've had an experience with it where it was very well held, it was facilitated, and there was kind of completion in the process. Also with supplements, right? Like all these kind of protocols that then, as if we talk about experiment, if I do this and I do this, then the outcome is different. And what was different is it didn't take as long to recover. I got more out of the experience, especially with the reflection of the person that I was working with that I didn't have from a previous experience. So through those kinds of experiences, it's not even just the psychedelic. It's like how I interact with it. It's like what comes before and after. It's exactly what you're talking about in preparing for and making sure I have the time to integrate and understand, be with what occurred. And that's kind of like the difference between an experiment of winging it and what you get, and when you have some really great preparation and integration after an experience and support around it and what you get. And there's a big difference. I think any of the research that we see where people have support before and after, we do see better outcomes. So, I mean, that's one example.
One thing you're speaking to is how we can engineer protocols for specific contexts and outcomes. And my sense is what you've been working on through Energy.Work, the role that technology can play, especially in the age of AI, is it allows us to access more data points. So that way those experiments are iterative, meaning we can actually learn not only from our own experiments, but ideally from the experiments of thousands of other practitioners who are also looking to work with MDMA or psilocybin or LSD or 5-MeO-DMT. So there's a way in which AI enables us to create this large data set or hive mind that allows then practitioners who are actively pursuing this work to make decisions that are more aligned with optimal outcomes. And of course, the tricky part is always the context is always different. Right? For every individual, the context is different, but there are, let's say, archetypes within those contexts. So, relationship work is a certain archetype, or creativity might be a certain archetype, or healing PTSD could be a certain archetype. So the more sort of awareness and context we develop about these archetypes, the more experiments we run within the categories, the better we can refine our protocols to help someone on their path of transformation, however that might look or whatever that might be.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I would say exactly that. There's something really important, I think, in what we're talking about in experimenting, in the kind of go slow and go slow and see, like, develop relationship. Like, it feels there's something here about empowering people to listen to their own intuition. And I think this is the part where technology often, and I see a comment that kind of alludes to this, is this idea that technology could actually help us think for ourselves through inquiry. And if the model is built so that it sees people as their own healing agent, that they actually have the answers for themselves, and it's just a matter of supporting people in finding their own answers and connecting with themselves, then it feels like technology could be supportive in this way, in understanding you and what might be the question, the exact question that's going to help you tap into that inner resource. And that's kind of how I think about technology supporting us.
I love that. And Bharvi has something about, can practitioners develop psychic communication with the help of psychedelics? And I think in this case, to me, it sounds like it's a both and, that the shamanic approach, which is often psychic or relying on this sort of connection to source to do the healing, we're really looking at, especially as more Westerners step into this work, yes, it's important to develop this capacity to work with the non-dual and to work with the mystery. And I would say there's also certain benefits that can be leveraged from having clarity that would improve overall outcomes. I'm not as certain that just because someone has worked, let's say they're a Shipibo curandera and they've worked in a lineage for many, many years, there's probably gaps in their practice that a Western psychiatrist would be able to help fill, even when it comes to psychiatric medications and how to navigate psychiatric medications and weaning off of those, because the Shipibo tradition does not have that context necessarily. So this comes back to being that bridge, right? Where we're looking at both technology and the spiritual world. I think the greatest task of practitioners who want to step into the space is bridging these two worlds of ancient wisdom and modern science. And that's how I've always thought about even this third wave of psychedelics, is if we can build a bridge between those two, we can generate outcomes, we can support people in their process. So it actually works, because to work with psychedelics is not a light undertaking. It does require that leap. It does require courage. And so it's ideal, if someone wants to step into that space, that they're supported to the best of our abilities, both with technology and with depth and presence and awareness.
Yeah. And I don't want to underestimate the power of data, right? The idea that we can take this data, and the more data we can, there's a lot of data we don't have. And we know this because we stopped studying, right? And it's just now, again, that we're gaining data on how psychedelics can help, who it helps, when it helps. Like, there's all these missing pieces around, because like you said, it's such a unique path. Each person has their own context and their own unique path and their own response. It's no one experience is the same and no one outcome is the same. Like, there really is a difference, but like you said, there's archetypes and I believe if we had the data, we would start to see trends. We would start to see ways that it helps and who it helps and when. And that's the big question I think we're sitting with, is how do we even collect that kind of data so that we could surface, when is this helping? When does LSD help? And what does it help with? And who? And where are they in their process? And, what's the dosage? Like, there is all these pieces that are kind of missing from the data that I think would be super helpful. And not only helpful for us to understand what might be helpful for the person that is coming to us for help, but also for the wider scientific community, that's what they need. Like, they need data in order to see that it's actually helping. And that's how it's going to be made more available, more acceptable, and possibly even legal, right? Is if we have that kind of data.
Yeah, data and research is key to accessibility. I read a recent study that pointed out how when Oregon legalized psilocybin and when Colorado legalized natural medicines, as soon as those legal policies were passed, there was a significant uptick in interest in those substances, both in Oregon and Colorado. So there is a lot of work happening in the underground. There's a mycelial network that is really growing and thriving. And I do think data is necessary if we are to see greater policy change, because that is really how accessibility is created. And that leads me to my next question, Tonia, which is around 5-MeO. And I wanted to get into this with you because from a personal level, you're quite experienced with 5-MeO DMT, which is also called Bufo alvarius. It can come in a natural form, which is the venom, the dried venom of the Sonoran desert toad. It also comes in a synthetic form, which is often called jaguar. And one modality that I've become really curious about lately is this ultra low dose 5-MeO DMT. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about kind of, to you, what is 5-MeO DMT? What is it as a molecule, as a medicine, as a psychedelic? But then more specifically, what's going on with ultra low dose 5-MeO? Because most of the conversation has been about very high doses of 5, white light, unity consciousness, mystical experience. What's going on with this ultra low dose 5-MeO DMT?
Yeah, that's really a great question. Well, one, I'm just going to start by saying that 5-MeO DMT was my introduction to this path. That was my first big experience was with toad medicine specifically. It does come from the Sonoran desert toad, which is, also endangered. So, I mean, at least it's getting there. Not only with the concrete that has grown over the top of all of their habitat, but also then it becoming more popular with the psychedelic world and more people harvesting from the toads. So I do have an affinity and love for that medicine because it got me on this path, and it also opened my mind to something that I had been looking for my whole life. It was like that searching for God and spirit in many, many years in my life before I had that experience. And it was like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. I've just had an embodied experience of that thing that I knew intellectually, but I had never had a full experience of. So, I mean, it is by far the closest to my heart. And so to talk about, there's also a snuff that they use in ancient cultures in South America that they found thousands of years ago evidence of. It's called yopo. So yeah, there are other, places where 5-MeO shows up. It is a very different than NN-DMT, which you can also get vaporized. So the low dose is a vaporized form. And I would say this ultra low dose is a lot more accessible to people. So these really large doses can be destabilizing. They can be really difficult on your system, especially your nervous system. So people can kind of get blown out and have a recovery time. There's also this risk, around your heart and your lungs. And there's just a lot of risk with these bigger experiences, both physically and mentally, I think emotionally and spiritually as well. Where the low doses, you can kind of test it out, really low dose, and see how that experience is. And what's really amazing is, and I can't wait for there to be studies on this, but what's really amazing about it is even with really low doses, people can have huge breakthroughs. Just small, just enough that they can feel it, and for the first time sometimes have some relief in their anxiety or their depression or I work with parts, and parts of us, especially those diligent, hyper-vigilant type of parts that kind of take hold and run the show, and we don't have any relief from them. It's like they are trained for survival to be this kind of hyper-vigilant, anxious, and it really messes with our nervous system. It messes with our lives, right? And it makes it really hard to function in life, in relationships, when you're in that state. And with those low doses, it's like a little bit of relief and space from those parts of us that have been like running our world. And so it's also easier on the system. You can stay in a downregulated state. You can move slowly. So there is something about this synthetic form of 5-MeO. One, my experience, I don't notice that much of a difference that it's worth, endangering the toad to have a natural form. I don't think there's enough of a difference that it's worth it. I think there are some scenarios where it could be helpful, but for the most part, synthetic, I think, can get you there. I mean, you can even have high dose 5-MeO experiences that are going to be really, really close, that are going to have a lot of the same benefits. And you don't have to use, toad medicine. So I'm really excited about this idea that 5-MeO could be so much more accessible. I know when I started researching it in the beginning and the synthetic versions that they were doing with research, it's like intramuscular or it's an IV. There isn't a low dose in any research right now, at least any official, like clinical research. I think there is some research going on underground, which I will definitely let everyone know as soon as I see any results from that, because I think that we're going to see that this is a really big breakthrough for us, for safe use of a psychedelic that can have profound and powerful effects on our lives and our well-being.
I know there's one biotech company called Beckley Psytech that was, I believe, recently acquired by Atai, and they are bringing intranasal 5-MeO DMT through clinical trials. I don't know precisely what the dose level is for that, if it would be categorized as low dose necessarily, or if it's similar to, ketamine or esketamine, which can also be delivered intranasally. And they're still going for that more intense experience. I do think one of the upsides or attractive points about ultra low dose 5-MeO that I've heard from, some of our practitioners, and I've even gone through this experience myself, is that it is shorter lasting. And so if doing guiding work or one-to-one work, rather than having it be a 6 to 8 hour experience like it is with psilocybin, ultra low dose 5-MeO, there's a trajectory to it where it may only last an hour. And so for folks who are quite new to this type of work, knowing that, you can sort of dip your toe in before you fully jump is a way to ease the process at starting to work with these medicines.
Yeah. And I think about people who are doing MDMA journeys, right? Facilitated MDMA journeys, working with parts and going through those processes that also are a 6-hour endeavor. And seeing how this can reach some of those places. And I've heard that people have some really meaningful breakthroughs in an hour, 2 hours.
So the final thing that we haven't yet talked about is the focus of a lot of your integration work and even ceremonial work with sound, which you facilitate. And what I've heard you talk about before is you're really focused on working with women in particular. And I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit more about why is it that you feel called to work with women specifically when it comes to prep and integration coaching and when it comes to ceremonial work with sound?
Yeah. That's a good question too. I I feel like primarily I like to work with women because I understand the experience of being a woman. And particularly a lot of my healing work and a lot of the work that I have done over the years is related to healing as a woman in our culture and what it means, to be valued in our culture. And so there is something specific to me about the female experience in our world. And that particularly has been an important part of my own bringing, that there's value in the feminine aspect. And again, back to archetypes, right? The feminine archetype and how that has really been lost in our world and devalued in our world. And I believe that with the balance of the feminine aspects in our world, Ian McGillichrist talks about like the left brain, right? And how we're overdeveloped in the left brain. Well, I think that's also a little overdeveloped in the masculine aspect. And I think that the feminine aspect is something that we need in our world. And so I want to encourage and support women in bringing that part of themselves to our existence, to our culture. One of the things that I notice a lot, especially working in tech, I was often one of the only women. And a lot of the women that I did see, it didn't feel like we were bringing the kind of the heart of what it is to be feminine to the world. It was like just trying to be masculine in a masculine world, right? And so we're missing the gifts that women bring, and that's one of the main reasons, because I feel like that balance is what we need. And so also kind of reaching the second half of life, and this is a whole nother world of transition that women are going through that is kind of untouched, untalked about. And I believe if we set more intention and have more ritual around these transitions in our life, that they can be more intentional, we will get more out of them. And it's kind of like guiding our own lives. And so with ceremony, we can create ritual to let go of what no longer serves us, bring into the world what we want to bring forward. We can have these kinds of markers in time that set kind of a stage for this next phase. And I think that that's also missing in our culture, not just for women, but for men as well, these markers in time where we transition from one phase of life to the next phase of life, and talking about and actually hearing from the elders that went ahead of us, what does that transition look like? Who do I want to be in this next phase of my life? What do I want to bring? There's also, I think, this thing around service. The first part of life feels more like, how do I become a good human? Like, how do I develop myself? And the second half feels a lot more like, how do I be of service? How do I now bring that and be of service to others? And so there's those kinds of things that I think the ceremony, the ritual, the rites of passage are a missing piece that I think are really important for us in our development as humans.
I love that, bringing back the feminine, and what better way to do that than through psychedelic work, right? Working with these medicines that for eons have been stewarded by most often the women and the feminine, and looking at this as an opportunity to disrupt the current system, to create a new paradigm that is really rooted in circling and service and healing and being with and relationship, right? These are all critical sort of aspects of the feminine that when we spend so much time focusing on tech and scaling and AI and even sometimes data, too much data, right, can take us away from that more intuitive approach to existence. Yeah.
And that's one of the things with Energy.Work that has been really important to me as I've ventured into this space is, how do we build something or create something that kind of grows itself? how do we model this after nature, which knows how to grow and evolve and change and adapt? How do we, and this is the big kind of question that I'm sitting with, how do we let it emerge? How do we tap into this innate intelligence that already exists to build something like a company, to build something like an offering that other people could contribute to or be a part of?
Beautiful. And that's a lovely way to end. Tonia, thank you so much for joining us for this live Psychedelic podcast. If folks want to learn more about Tonia's work, I believe it's ToniaErin.com, which I've dropped in the chat. I've already dropped Energy.Work, so you can get a sense of that platform that Tonia has been supporting and helping to build out. Any sort of final places you'd just like to point people to or bring awareness to before we wrap up?
No, nowhere else to really find me. I tend to be a little elusive. Just want to thank you, Paul, for all your work in this space and for inviting me on the podcast. Some of the most important people in my life are because I went through your programs. And so I really appreciate that and appreciate the work you're doing in the psychedelic space. Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you so much, Tonia. It's been so lovely connecting with you and getting to know you. And even when I lived in Utah, spending time with you and Anne at your place in Salt Lake. So it's really been an honor to facilitate this conversation and bring in your wisdom and your perspectives. And I would encourage anyone listening to just check out a little bit more about Tonia. That's Tonia Erin, ERIN.com. And we'll also link to that in the show notes. So Tonia, thank you again for joining us today for the podcast.
Thanks, Paul. It's good to see you.
Hey, listeners, Paul here. I hope you enjoyed our episode today with Tonia Erin. If you want to go deeper, check out the show notes, join our community platform at community.thethirdwave.co, or simply share this episode with a friend or two who you think might be interested in this intersection between technology and spirituality. It was really an honor to host Tonia for this show. And if you're interested in exploring the practitioner training program, go to the psychedeliccoaching.institute. That's psychedeliccoaching.institute to learn more about our upcoming cohorts and how you can become a psychedelic practitioner. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to grow your own medicine for microdosing or high dose experiences, check out our Mushroom Grow Kit. It's the simplest way to get a reliable source of high quality mushrooms, and it includes detailed videos walking you through the entire process. No guessing, just clear instructions for best results. Check out the link in the description below.